Now, good morning and welcome to the first session of the Scottish COVID-19's Inquiry's Substantive Evidential Hearings, which will focus on health and social care impacts of the pandemic. I do beg its pardon. I wish to begin by reiterating my sincere condolences and those of the inquiry team to those who lost loved ones to COVID-19, and our sympathy to the many people who have been and continue to be affected by the pandemic. I am aware that some people experience physical and mental health issues after contracting COVID-19 and continue to suffer from those long-lasting impacts. For the families of the bereaved and those still living with COVID-related conditions, the pandemic's legacy will never end. We extend our deepest sympathies. During our health and social care impact hearings, we will hear from some of the people most profoundly impacted by COVID-19. Witnesses will include bereaved family members, care home relatives, and people who were required to shield because of underlying health conditions. We will also listen to the accounts of others who continue to suffer the pandemic's consequences, such as people with long COVID, and those who are unable to receive the urgent medical treatment they required because of the pressures the pandemic placed on the NHS. In addition, in the next phase of hearings, commencing in February of next year, we will hear the accounts of key workers, including frontline health and social care staff, who did all they could to try and alleviate others' suffering, at times putting their own health at risk. These hearings will give a voice to all of these people. Their experiences will help inform the inquiry's ongoing investigations, including into the decisions taken by Scotland's leaders, which we will turn to at a later date. As I have said previously, the inquiry team is resolutely committed to conducting a robust investigation without fear or favour. We will not take sides, and we will act with fairness towards everyone involved. By delivering a robust, independent inquiry with a clear set of recommendations, we hope to reduce suffering and deaths in the event of any future pandemic and prevent others from having to experience the distress and sorrow which COVID-19 caused. I should remind you, however, that the inquiry is not a court. It cannot make any findings of civil or criminal liability, nor is it set up to be able to award any compensation. Giving evidence at a public inquiry will be daunting for many of those involved, particularly for those grieving for loved ones and others living every day with the legacy of COVID-19. I would like to thank everyone who gives evidence to this inquiry for their courage, commitment, and public service, for which we in the inquiry are all immensely grateful. We recognise that for some witnesses, being asked to relive traumatic experiences can be extremely challenging, which is why the inquiry has adopted a trauma-informed and human rights-based approach in conducting both its investigations and hearings. We have set aside a dedicated room at Regis Princes Street for use by any attendees who are upset or distressed during the proceedings and need to take time out of the viewing room. We also have dedicated private rooms for witnesses at George House. Inquiry staff trained in trauma-informed practice will be available here and out of our viewing room at Regis Princes Street to provide emotional support and signposting to specialist support organisations. A Cruise Scotland bereavement counsellor is also available at both venues. In addition, we have published on the inquiry website a list of independent organisations which can provide support to people affected by the pandemic. If you require any assistance while attending the hearings, please speak to a member of inquiry staff who can be identified by their orange lanyards. My aim is to report as soon as possible while ensuring the inquiry conducts a robust and thorough investigation. This means that by necessity, we have to limit the number of witnesses who will give evidence. In discussion with core participants' legal representatives, to whom we are grateful, we have sought to bring forward the accounts of people whose experiences are representative of the issues and themes the inquiry will investigate. Through Let's Be Heard, our listening project, we are encouraging as many people as possible to share their experiences of the pandemic in Scotland with us, to tell us how they were affected, and to share the lessons they believe should be learned. You can find out more about Let's Be Heard on the inquiry's website. I wish to assure you that everyone's experience is valued and all information shared with us will be analysed and will inform our reports and recommendations. We anticipate that the inquiry's health and social care impact hearings will conclude in spring 2024. However, with a public inquiry of this unprecedented breadth and scale, it may be the case that we will need to revisit this and other timescales. I am joined today by several inquiry colleagues who will be assisting me during the course of these impact hearings. Stuart Gale KC, who is sitting in front of me and has just nodded in acknowledgement, is co-lead counsel to the inquiry. Alan Caskey KC, who is sitting behind him, is senior counsel to the inquiry. And Gordon McNichol is the interim solicitor to the inquiry, and he's the gentleman who's not nodding at you, but has now. Mr. Gale and the council team will be responsible for questioning witnesses during our health and social care hearings. However, before Mr. Gale begins, I wish, in fact, I think I have to share a few housekeeping points with you. We have shared witness statements and documentary bundles with core participants who have an interest in health and social care and who I have granted leave to appear. These will be published on the inquiry's website, where we will also publish transcripts of our hearings. Any directions or orders, including restriction orders that I have made or will make in the future, will also be published on the inquiry website. Ordinarily, hearings will begin at 10 o'clock and run until approximately 4 p.m. There may be occasions when hearings begin earlier than 10 a.m, and I would ask you to please check the hearings calendar on the inquiry's website for details or follow our social media channels. All attendees should arrive in good time to be seated in the hearing room for the start time. We will break for lunch at about 1 p.m, and there will be a short morning and afternoon break. The health, safety and well-being of all those attending hearing is a priority for the inquiry. Hand sanitizer and disposable face coverings will be available for use by all attendees who wish to avail themselves of that. The hearing room is ventilated by mechanical means with capacity managed to meet the British Council for Offices standards. I would also ask that if you are feeling unwell, you please do not attend and follow the hearing via the broadcast on the inquiry's YouTube channel if you're able to. Eating and drinking is not allowed in the hearing room except for water. Smartphones and other electronic devices are allowed, though they should be on silent mode at all times while you're in the hearing room. You should not make or accept private calls, take photographs or make video or audio recordings in the hearing room at any time. Hearings should proceed without disruption or interruption. Anyone attempting to disrupt a hearing may be required to leave the venue. Inquiry proceedings are broadcast on the inquiry's YouTube channel, where they may also be viewed and watched on demand. Video cameras are located at the rear and sides of the hearing room and face the front. You should be aware that members of the public attending our hearings may be captured occasionally on wide-angle or room overview camera shots. To assist with the video recording and transcriptions, I would ask all parties to state their names when addressing the inquiry, speak clearly into the microphone, and not to speak too quickly. I would now hand over to Mr. Gale KC, who will provide more detail on how we intend to conduct these hearings. Mr. Gale.
My Lord, thank you. Good morning, and good morning to everybody in the room, and good morning to everybody who is listening to us and watching us on our online service. As will be appreciated by your Lordship, together with everybody else here today and watching us, today is a significant milestone in the progression of this inquiry. Today and tomorrow we will hear opening statements from core participants with leave to appear in this section of the inquiry. And on Friday of this week, we will commence our first evidential hearings. These will continue until the week ending Friday, the 8th of December. There will then be a pause in our proceedings, and in January of next year, the UK inquiry will be conducting hearings in Scotland. This inquiry will resume in February next year, and as my Lord has said, will continue until Easter of next year in these hearings. In the hearings between now and Easter, we will hear from those who have been impacted in Scotland by the pandemic and its consequences. The focus is on the impacts in health and social care. As we previously stated, the inquiry took a deliberate and considered decision to commence its investigative work, leading to our first evidential hearings, by considering the impacts that the strategic decisions taken by the Scottish Government and implemented by it, its agencies and others, had upon the population of Scotland, all within the inquiry's terms of reference. At the risk of some repetition, I would like to reiterate the rationale behind that decision. The strategic decisions taken during the pandemic affected everybody in this country. They placed restrictions on our lives that had not been previously experienced during peacetime. The former First Minister said on the 23rd of March 2020, and I quote, "For everyone, you must stay at home unless it is absolutely necessary to go out, and that includes working from home wherever possible." The restrictions which followed on from that broad instruction, whether they took the form of legislative directions or guidance, had an ongoing effect on our lives for the next 2.5 years. In that period, politicians, decision makers, and implementers had to act in circumstances of developing and fluctuating urgency, having regard to novel and distressing circumstances. As your Lordship said in the preliminary hearing, which was held on the 28th of August of this year, and I quote, "The COVID-19 pandemic presented the most serious public health crisis in living memory. It affected everyone." So why impacts? It appeared to us in the inquiry team that to properly understand both the decision-making and the implementation of those decisions, we should consider them having regard to the impacts which they had. The inquiry did not subscribe to the view that impacts were matters apparent to us without further examination. Consideration of the statements that the inquiry has taken and the information that it has gathered has reinforced us in that view. The detail and nuances of the impacts have informed us and will be used by us when we come to examine the decision-making process, and in particular, whether the impacts and their adverse effects could and should have been anticipated and factored into the decision-making process and the implementation of the decisions. Recently, I noted in a statement an observation by a health professional that there required to be, and I quote, "a better understanding of vulnerable groups and their needs. The soft stuff, emotional and spiritual care, is important, and we really only focused on the hard stuff." In addition, we have obtained a statement from Dr. Jennifer Burns, who I will refer to in more detail in due course. And in her statement, she says this: if there is another pandemic, it is likely to have similar impact on older people and those with other vulnerabilities. And she goes on, the need to ensure is to ensure a balance is achieved between protecting care home residents from a virus that could be fatal to them, and also protecting the human rights of individuals to see their families and loved ones. Planning for the response to a pandemic should involve experts on the population most affected by the illness in question at the earliest possible stage. That seems to us to encapsulate a very significant issue which this inquiry needs to address. The inquiry has also issued, as my Lord has said, a policy statement on our trauma-informed and human rights-based approach. At paragraph 11 of that statement, we say that in line with that approach, we took the decision to begin public hearings with evidence of the impacts of the pandemic had on people, giving a voice to those who are most affected. Again, with the benefit of having read many statements, we hope that for some witnesses, there will be a cathartic relief in expressing their accounts of deeply distressing experiences in public and to this inquiry, knowing that it will form a public record of those experiences. We also recognize for many people who will be giving evidence to us in these impact hearings that they would rather be in any place but here, that they could have avoided the tragedy and the circumstances that have brought them here. The inquiry is extremely grateful for all those witnesses who have given their time and consideration to engage with us. Can I indicate at this stage that the inquiry's investigations have been informed by material from a number of sources? The inquiry team has worked tirelessly over the past months in assembling that information, and I would want to pay tribute to them all for their work. Members of the public have communicated directly with the inquiry in conveying information. Other members of the public have engaged with the listening arm of the inquiry's operation, Let's Be Heard. Other members of the public have engaged with us through organised groups, and in particular, I'd like to thank the Care Home Relatives Scotland group and their solicitors, Thompsons, and the Scottish COVID Bereaved and their solicitors, Amar Anwar and Company, for the assistance which they have given the inquiry in identifying witnesses and arranging for the inquiry's team of statement takers to have access to those witnesses. The ultimate decision as to which witnesses provide oral evidence to the inquiry is mine. These decisions have not always been easy, and the aim, so far as I have been concerned, is to identify those witnesses who will give oral evidence so as to provide a broad range of evidence of impacts. I would, however, as my Lord has already done, like to emphasize to everybody who has provided information to the inquiry, but who has not been asked to give oral evidence, your information is important to us and will be considered by us. Also, in connection with the health and social care portfolio, I would like to mention the academic research that the inquiry has commissioned. Introductory academic research was published on the inquiry website in June 2022. That research covered the period up to April 2022. Given the terms of the inquiry's remit, reports for both portfolios 1 and 3 is the health and social care portfolio, have been updated to cover the period up to the 31st of December 2022. And these were published on our website last week. In addition, the inquiry has received from Professor Mackay and his team at Napier University the first draft on the provision of social care support, including the management and support of staff and the recognition, involvement and support of unpaid carers. The final draft of that report is expected shortly. Other areas of ongoing academic research include research into the impact of the pandemic on refugees and asylum seekers and the impact of the pandemic on women and girls. These reports are those which have relevance to portfolios 1 and 3. Further research has been carried out in relation to portfolios 2 and 4 and will be available on the inquiry website in the forthcoming months. I would like to also give an update on the work of the inquiry's Let's Be Heard project. Its national engagement phase began on the 23rd of May of this year with the aim of encouraging the Scottish public to share their experience of the pandemic, to describe the impacts of the pandemic which had, and to provide views of the lessons they think should be learned. Let's Be Heard has had almost 4,000 responses from individuals and groups from across the country. The national engagement phase has been extended until the 20th of December of this year, and the inquiry would like to thank everyone who has taken part so far for their invaluable contribution to the inquiry's understanding of matters across the board. Over the previous months, the Let's Be Heard team has been involved in over 50 events across the country. They have also supported group discussions with a range of people on different topics, such as unpaid carers, people living with dementia, women who were pregnant during the pandemic, and those persons with sensory impairments. Let's Be Heard has heard from people in every council area in Scotland, and there has been a particularly strong response from working age Scots. Those who have responded have offered a depth and richness of experience on themes such as the trauma of bereavement, separation from loved ones, how lockdown impacted mental health, both positively and negatively, the crucial role played by key workers, and how school closures affected children's education. To extend the range of information received, Let's Be Heard would particularly welcome hearing more directly from children and young people so that adults aren't speaking on their behalf. Further communication from people of retirement age, as well as from men, and from those who are less financially secured, would be appreciated. Geographically, Let's Be Heard has heard proportionately less from people in North Lanarkshire, South Lanarkshire, West Lothian, Renfrewshire, and Glasgow City. It is also seeking further insight into the experiences of people across the Highlands and Islands, and is also keen to hear from people from a diverse range of ethnic and religious backgrounds, people born outside the UK and Scotland, as well as people whose first language is not English. The inquiry wishes to ensure that all your views are heard by us. In addition, the inquiry has followed carefully the hearings in the UK inquiry and is mindful of our obligation not to duplicate material with that inquiry. Turning to the timetable, our hearings will commence on Friday this week and will continue next week, when we will present evidence from a number of witnesses speaking as representatives of organizations that have advised and supported people during the pandemic. In assembling information, it appeared to us that the inquiry would benefit from hearing from those who saw at first hand the effects of the pandemic and the strategic decisions that were taken on wider groups of individuals. We will hear first from Jane Morrison on behalf of the COVID Bereaved Scotland Group. She will speak movingly about the loss of her wife, Jackie, from COVID, and provide us with detailed observations of both good and bad practices gleaned from her experiences and from those of members of the group who have encountered bereavement during the pandemic in various circumstances. She will also discuss prolonged grief disorder in the context of a loss during the pandemic. We will also hear from 4 core members of the Care Home Relatives Scotland Group, a group that was established during the pandemic with the aim of enhancing the quality of life of loved ones who were resident in care homes by working to achieve the resumption of essential family contact. In particular, we will hear the efforts to secure Anne's Law. And I think it's useful if I just indicate what those objectives are. They are that every care home resident should be entitled to have meaningful contact with one nominated person, despite any type of lockdown the care home experiences. That the nominated person has to be recognized as a partner in care and trusted to access the care home in the same way as staff do. Recognition that the nominated person is there to provide emotional and well-being care, something that a member of staff cannot offer as much as we know they may try to do so. To recognize that many people residing in care homes have complex needs, and that allowing one nominated person to have meaningful contact can and will ease distress for both of them and their families. And finally, to recognize that a nominated carer would also help to support the work of care staff. We will also see how the present legislative proposal on that matter fits with those objectives. Next week, we will also hear from 2 witnesses, Henry Simmons, the Chief Executive of Alzheimer Scotland, and Dr. Jennifer Burns, who I mentioned earlier. Dr. Burns was the president of the British Geriatric Society for the period of the pandemic up to her retirement at the end of November 2022. They both have particular expertise in supporting those with Alzheimer's and dementia, and those in need of more general geriatric care. These witnesses will assist the inquiry in understanding dementia and frailty. Your Lordship may remember that he raised the issue of frailty when Dr. Croft gave evidence. It's day 2 of Dr. Croft's evidence at page 35 of the transcript. And the evidence of Dr. Burns assists in understanding frailty. Both Dr. Burns and Mr. Simmons assist in our understanding of the complexities and the various stages of Alzheimer's and dementia from diagnosis. This assists us in setting some of the evidence that we'll hear from relatives and loved ones in context. If there is one thing that comes out from reading many of the statements, it is that for some whose loved ones suffered dementia, there had already been a loss of the person they knew. Coincidental with my involvement in this query, I heard what I thought was a very insightful song, written from the perspective of a woman whose husband was a resident in a care home suffering dementia. And in the song they had, and I quote, "moments when clarity reigned." But a particular line from that song came to me many times as I read the various statements. It was that, quote, "surgery leaflets offer advice, but there's no preparation for losing him twice." In the course of next week, we will also hear from Sarah Redmond, who speaks on behalf of the Health and Social Care Alliance Scotland, which is the national third sector intermediary for health and social care. We will also hear from Tressa Burke of the Glasgow Disability Alliance, an organisation which has over 5,500 members and which is now a leading example of a grassroots community driving improvements in the lives of disabled people. We will hear also from Dr. Marcia Scott, who is the Chief Executive of Scottish Women's Aid, who will provide a statement together with Catherine Murphy of Engender on behalf of 5 organisations: Scottish Women's Aid, Close the Gap, Just Right Scotland, Rape Crisis Scotland, and Engender, who together are referred to as Scottish women's rights organisations. We will also hear from Helen Goss, who is the Chief Operating Officer of Long Covid Kids Scotland. And the inquiry has previously announced that, having taken legal advice on the matter, that it would look at the healthcare impacts of long COVID, where those potentially affected the strategic response to the pandemic. Thereafter, we will embark on our detailed examination of individual impact statements. In the period from early November until the 8th of December, we will hear from members of the Care Home Relatives Scotland Group, the Skye Care Home Group, the Scottish COVID Bereaved Group, and from individuals who are not part of any organised group. Next year, when we resume our hearings in February, we will hear from organisations who supported those who were employed in the health and social care sector, and from individuals who will speak to the personal impacts. We will also hear from unpaid carers. We will hear from those who are impacted in the hospital setting and those impacted in the community. We will also hear from particular groups who were impacted by the pandemic and its circumstances: refugees and asylum seekers, those who are homeless, those who are drug and alcohol dependent, those who are in prison and custody, those from ethnic and minority communities. We'll also hear from long COVID kids and those who have been impacted having been vaccinated. We will also hear from representatives of those who are in receipt of end-of-life and palliative care. In considering all the statements that we have received, a number of common themes do emerge. In particular, we will hear from witnesses of the emotional trauma of bereavement during the pandemic. Death occurred in different locations and in varying circumstances. Jane Morrison puts it this way when she's talking of the bond that exists between those who experience bereavement. I quote, "I think we've all found out that bereavement during a pandemic is a very different thing from, for want of a better expression, normal bereavement. People were denied the opportunity to be with loved ones in the times before and the moments of their passing, and then in the period after death, all at times when comfort was most needed. There were restrictions on funeral services, and in particular restrictions on the numbers attending. The inability of families to grieve together and to offer mutual comfort. The difficulties presented by the restrictions with what should otherwise have been the relatively straightforward arrangements in the period after bereavement. The harsh reality of bereavement is conveyed by the number of deaths. As at 15th October, just over a week ago, just more than a week ago, and this is the most recent date for which figures are available, the number of deaths in Scotland in which COVID-19 was mentioned was 18,037. As at the same date, the number of deaths where COVID-19 was the underlying cause was 14,272. There have been frequent observations made by witnesses regarding the confusion they experienced in navigating their way through the legislation and the guidance which regulated the contact that they could have with loved ones. Of particular concern was the often rapid and sometimes contradictory changes. We will hear of inconsistencies in the applications of rules and guidance across different settings at the same time, and indeed on occasions within the same setting. Many witnesses speak of the need for proper, considered, and compassionate communication. This was necessary in all situations where those in charge of the care of an individual were communicating with that individual and with loved ones. In particular, it was necessary in the circumstances of end-of-life care and the use of do not attempt cardiopulmonary resuscitation notices. Other common themes include the following: the impact of social isolation and loneliness, which was particularly acute where an individual's cognitive functions were impaired. The difficulties of communicating through windows and by way of handheld devices. Relationships between family members and their loved ones were adversely impacted, particularly where those were people with dementia or impaired cognitive abilities, and they experienced frustration in not understanding the reasons for the restrictions. Where an individual is cared for at home with family members, or they were otherwise in the community, their carers, who are often unpaid, were placed under increased and sometimes intolerable stress. Family members witnessed the mental and physical deterioration of their loved ones, deterioration which they frequently put down to isolation and its accompanying circumstances. Frequently, there were feelings of helplessness, feelings of frustration, of anger, of guilt, and inadequacy on the part of family members. Family members and carers themselves suffered adverse impacts on their mental and physical well-being. Changes in care routines were frequently abrupt and unexpected, from home or otherwise in the community to care homes, from care homes to hospitals, from hospitals to care homes. Concerns were frequently expressed about the availability of treatments for ongoing conditions. There was also a lack of respite for carers, leading often to carer exhaustion. In the forthcoming weeks, the inquiry will hear distressing accounts of enforced separation from loved ones, the effects that isolation had on people, whether they were in institutions or in their own homes, whether they were young or old, whether they were capable of comprehending the circumstances or not. The nature and extent of those impacts are largely presented by their family members and friends who viewed the impacts from the outside. Of particular force is the evidence from loved ones who had to deal with the impacts on elderly relatives, and in particular those who were affected by dementia. Witnesses express in varying ways their frustration about their inability to have meaningful contact with their loved ones. Many, but not all, of those suffering from dementia were elderly and frail. In the famous soliloquy in As You Like It, spoken by Jacques, and begins All the World's a Stage, it talks of the seventh age of life and the faculties that leave or diminish in that age. What is apparent from many of the statements the inquiry has received that in the time of the pandemic, many in the seventh age of life spent their days sans the comfort, the compassion, and the understanding that would normally come from contact with their families and loved ones. As we embark on these hearings, on behalf of my council team, the wider inquiry team and myself, I take this opportunity to convey to all those bereaved and to all those who have suffered during the pandemic and those who continue to suffer our sincere and genuine condolences and sympathies. Thank you, my Lord.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, we'll turn to opening statements on behalf of co-participants, and we will hear firstly from the Scottish Ministers, who I understand is represented by Mr. Geoffrey Mitchell, KC. If we could come forward now. Can I say, while Mr. Mitchell is coming forward, you're all aware that you've been allocated 20 minutes each, and the reason for that will be pretty obvious. We've got a fair number to get through, and as a matter simply of expedition and efficiency, we've had to limit you to 20 minutes. I don't want to sound rather headmasterly, but I'll keep you to 20 minutes. And if that means cutting you off in mid-flow, I will. I'm sure I won't have to. With that admonition, Mr. Mitchell, please.
Thank you, my Lord. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the opening statement on behalf of the Scottish Government. I appear today along with Kenneth Maguire, Advocate. We are instructed by Caroline Beattie of the Scottish Government Legal Directorate. I would like to thank the inquiry for granting the Scottish Government leave to appear at these hearings and for the opportunity to make these opening remarks. As the body that was responsible for steering a path for Scotland through the pandemic, the Scottish Government is well placed to explain the strategic decisions made during that time. Those decisions are not, however, the immediate focus of the inquiry. The focus of the current hearings is the impact of the pandemic on and experienced by those within the Scottish health and social care sector. The Scottish Government is too well aware of the loss and suffering experienced in that sector and, of course, in Scotland as a whole. Today, on behalf of the Scottish Government, I would like to recognise that loss. All of Scotland suffered, yet undeniably some suffered far more than others. Thousands lost their lives, and their families and friends continue to grieve. The health of many individuals has been affected in innumerable ways. Many people lost their jobs, while living circumstances of others were affected in countless different ways. Children and young people, often thought to be less susceptible to the virus than adults, nevertheless suffered greatly also. Further, many people continued to work through the pandemic in extremely challenging circumstances. This pain, suffering, sacrifice, and endurance is recognised, understood, and acknowledged by the Scottish Government. Yet recognition, understanding, acknowledgement are plainly not sufficient. The Scottish Government understands that legitimate questions arise as to whether the suffering needed to have been so great. This was one of the reasons that the Scottish Government established this judge-led statutory inquiry into the handling of the pandemic in Scotland. It was also one of the reasons why, when the inquiry was first established by the former First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, she emphasised that it would take a person-centred human rights approach. Indeed, one of the inquiry's terms of reference is, quote, to demonstrate how a human rights-based approach by the inquiry has contributed to the inquiry's findings in fact and recommendations. The Scottish Government understands that the most meaningful and genuine way to recognise the loss suffered is to listen to the evidence and to learn lessons from it. To that end, it is important that I stress that the Scottish Government is fully committed to the inquiry process, to the Chair, and to the people of Scotland. That commitment is to assist, to cooperate fully and openly, to listen and to learn. I recognise that, for some people, the giving of evidence at these public hearings will be a difficult experience. I can reassure any such person that their evidence will be listened to by the Scottish Government with great respect and consideration. I should firstly make clear one important point. That is the distinction between, on the one hand, decisions made on health and social care during the pandemic by the UK Government, and on the other hand, those made on behalf of the Scottish Government. This is relevant since, as we know, Module 2 of the UK Covid-19 inquiry is currently hearing evidence that relates to the UK's core political and administrative decision-making in relation to the pandemic between early January 2020 until February 2022. This will doubtless include evidence on decisions taken by the UK Government in relation to health and social care in England. The important point is this: public health, the NHS, social care and social services are generally devolved matters in Scotland. That is, in Scotland, the Scottish Government has primary responsibility for and the powers necessary to make decisions in these areas. Given the widely varying geographical and epidemiological circumstances across Scotland, and conscious of the need to balance the impact on social and economic activity of measures necessary to suppress virus transmission, the Scottish Government took the approach of tailoring restrictions to local circumstances. The Scottish Government, where possible, worked in partnership with a number of bodies, including, for example, NHS boards, Centre of Sustainable Delivery, and Public Health Scotland. The decisions that it took in these areas were always taken in the interests of people in Scotland. I turn now to the issue of impact in the area of health and social care and begin by setting out in a little more detail the ways in which the impact was felt. The entire health and social care system was affected in multiple and varied ways. Structures, services, processes, and organisations were all impacted. Most importantly, however, the impact was felt by individuals, also in multiple and varied ways. Factors such as COVID-19 infection control requirements, the redeployment of staff, the ability of hospitals to provide the capacity to treat COVID-19 patients, delayed discharges, and COVID-19 related staff absences all had a detrimental effect on the system and consequently on individuals. Some people were reluctant to seek medical help for fear of contracting the virus. Some adult screening programs, for example, for the detection of cancer, were paused during the pandemic. Some of the impacts continue to be felt. For example, there has been an increase in waiting times for certain medical treatment. The impact on the social care sector was severe. Deaths that occurred in care homes and that were attributable to COVID-19 accounted for a significant percentage of all COVID-19 deaths in Scotland. visiting restrictions cause great hardship for residents and families. The suffering of residents and the continuing pain of their relatives is palpable. Evidence on these issues will surely and understandably figure prominently in these hearings. The pandemic affected the health and social care workforce in jobs that were already demanding and that carried high levels of responsibility in any event. The pandemic presented further challenges of stress and fatigue for hospital and social care staff. Their roles were further complicated by the shortage at times of personal protective equipment, or PPE, when unprecedented demand placed strain on the distribution mechanisms. There has also been an impact on the health of the Scottish people in a variety of ways. For example, in addition to illness and death caused directly by the virus, the mental health of the population suffered. The full impact of long COVID has yet to be fully understood, and pre-existing health inequalities were exacerbated. Truly, the full effects of COVID-19 have yet to become clear. The Scottish Government is fully committed to the recovery of the NHS and the social care system to its pre-pandemic level and beyond. The detail for recovery will no doubt be dealt with in future hearings, but I shall briefly mention three aspects. First, the NHS Recovery Plan of 2021 to 2026 sets out how the Scottish Government will address the backlog in care, meet the ongoing health needs of the population, enhance primary and community care, and enhance well-being support. Second, an early example of recovery planning was the Scottish Government's Mental Health Transition and Recovery Plan, published in October 2020 and backed by £120 million of investment in recognition of the negative impact of the pandemic and associated restrictions on people's mental health, coupled with the limitations it placed on clinical services. The Scottish Government expanded the range of support available from public messaging to new digital services. Third, a further early example of recovery planning was the report Coronavirus COVID-19 Initial Health and Social Care Response, Lessons Identified. Focusing on the period March to September 2020, the report examined what worked well and what improvements could be made so that Scotland was better equipped for an ongoing recovery and remobilisation plans. I turn now to the four harms approach. Standing the focus of the current hearings, it is not appropriate to explore strategic decision-making. However, the Scottish Government does consider that, if the inquiry is to hear evidence about impact, it should have an understanding of the principles that were applied to decision-making in an attempt to manage that impact. What I propose to do is briefly to explain to those listening, not the decisions themselves, but rather the steps that were taken to minimise the impact or harm suffered during the pandemic. COVID-19 posed an unprecedented systemic threat not only to the health of those susceptible to infection, but also to healthcare systems, economic activity, and wider society. The Scottish Government's strategic aim in dealing with the pandemic, and in particular in the development and use of non-pharmaceutical interventions, or NPIs, was to minimise the overall harm of the pandemic through the whole of Scotland. Not merely in the urban areas, but also in the most rural and remote areas where people live. In April 2020, building on the Coronavirus Action Plan that had been published by the four governments of the UK, the Scottish Government explained the way it would take future decisions on its pandemic response in a document entitled The Framework for Decision-Making. This document sets out the Scottish Government's principles and approach to dealing with the pandemic, particularly in relation to the use of NPIs. A key part of the approach described and enshrined within the framework was to marshal the many and various harms of the pandemic into four categories, or harms. The concept of four harms, as the strategy became known, was that, broadly speaking, the pandemic and measures in response to it could cause harm in four areas, namely, firstly, direct COVID-19 health harms. Primarily, this is the mortality or morbidity associated with contracting the disease. Secondly, broader health harms, Primarily, this is the impact on the effective operation of the NHS and social care services associated with large numbers of patients with COVID-19 and its consequential effects on the treatment of illness. Third, social harms. The harms to our wider society in terms, for example, of education attainment as a result of school closures. And fourth, economic harms, for example, through the closure of businesses and workplaces. Indicators chosen as representing key aspects of each harm were reported on an online portal called the 4 Harms Dashboard to support understanding of the impact of the pandemic across the 4 harms. This included key indicators on the direct health impacts, such as trends in COVID-19 hospital admissions, as well as wider impacts on health and social services, societal impacts, and economic impacts, such as the number of accident and emergency admissions and planned hospital admissions. I must emphasize that equality's impacts and issues of fundamental human rights were considered alongside the 4 harms. Inequalities were regarded as a factor within each of the 4 harms. This ensured that equalities issued were included within the assessments made of each of the 4 harms and not viewed in isolation of the other factors. This approach is consistent with the aspirations of the Scottish Government, both before and after the pandemic, to build equality into policy making across all areas of government. The complexity of the systemic challenge posed by the rapid spread and evolution of the COVID-19 virus meant that there was no single or individual correct response. The Scottish Government had to address an alarming situation that posed a threat to the whole of society. It had to calibrate its decision-making to address multiple issues, often under great time pressure. It quickly became apparent, given the nature of the challenges posed by the virus, that there were few, if any, harm-free decisions open to governments, including the Scottish Government. Measures designed to curtail the spread of the virus reduced the direct health harm, but on the downside risked causing isolation and loneliness, economic upheaval and disruption to education. On the other hand, a decision not to impose or lift restrictions might be said to lessen wider harms, but only at the risk of possibly increasing harm to health. The 4 harms were interlinked, and this was well understood by the Scottish Government at the time. For example, an increase in unemployment and poverty would have, over time, both physical and mental health implications. The challenge was for the Scottish Government and other governments to balance risks and benefits and take decisions to reduce overall harm as much as possible. In conclusion, let me repeat and reaffirm something that I said at the outset of this statement, that the Scottish Government will listen to the evidence given at these impact hearings with great respect and consideration. The Scottish Government is committed to learning from that evidence. The Scottish Government is grateful to the Chair, my Lord, for the opportunity to make this opening statement. My team and I hope that we can be of assistance to the inquiry in the weeks to come.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Mitchell. Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, actually a little ahead of time, we will take the break now, which will be for 20 minutes. So we'll come back not at 11:30 as the programme says, but about 11:20.